Maison Ikkoku. A lot of words could be used to describe this manga. It's a Rumiko Takahashi classic, and one of her more mature works. It's a romantic comedy that exceeds the norms of other manga in this genre. A little bit about the premise. Its setting is in 1980s Tokyo, and takes place in a boarding house called Maison Ikkoku, filled with eccentric residents. One of these residents is Yusuke Godai, our protagonist. He's a poor student, and the story begins with him at his last straw, dealing with the other residents of Maison Ikkoku, getting ready to leave until the new manager, a young widow named Kyoko, arrives. Godai instantly becomes infatuated with Kyoko and cancels any plans to leave Maison Ikkoku, setting the beginning of our story. The way Maison Ikkoku differs from many of Rumiko Takahashi's other works is the real development that takes place. Whether it's Godai's character development throughout the series, going from a down-on-his-luck student with nothing to show for himself other than his youth, to an imperfect but respectable young man working on his goals, whether it's his career or relationship, or the realistic progression the story has with all of its characters and their lives, moving the plot forward diligently, unlike most anime or manga in this genre. One of the most impressive aspects of Maison Ikkoku is the story is very realistic without being boring. It's original while also having incredibly relatable characters. Even though most men live lives far different from Godai, the struggles he goes through as a young man can resonate with just about any guy over the age of 20. Godai has so many aspects of his life to worry about, whether it be his present situation or his future, and the future of people around him. Godai in the first half of the manga feels immense pressure to become a successful salaryman, despite the harsh assumptions that come with graduating from a third-rate university in Japan. Godai can't help comparing himself to other men and standards set for men, and it belittles him, and it kills his self-esteem and confidence, limiting the things he wants to do in his life. These are struggles anyone can relate to, especially young men who don't have everything figured out. Men working towards their happiness, struggling with questions like are they good enough to achieve the happiness they seek? While Godai is relatable to many, Kyoko is interesting as her role of being a young widow sets her apart from a large majority of readers. But it works amazingly in tandem to Godai. Her main worry in life is if it's okay for her to love again. With her husband being deceased, she worries if getting remarried would devalue her love for her husband, if it would make her previous relationship and love for him fake. This isn't the only worry Kyoko has in her life. As a 21-year-old widow, she has a long life ahead of her, and she has to figure it out by herself after the tragic passing of her husband. Kyoko, like Godai, has standards put on her. Her mother pushes her to get remarried, while her father wants her to remain his daughter. While Kyoko's mother wants her to get remarried, and her father becomes very protective of her, they both feel as though being a widow has compromised her value as a woman and worry for her future, believing that it has made her less desirable to potential suitors. This is terrible for a young lady to be exposed to after the loss of her husband, to be devalued and feel less desirable because of her tragedy. This is a terrible thing to go through for a young lady. These are strong emotions and struggles to relate to, and it's entwined so well with the story as it builds up throughout each volume. Seeing these two characters struggle and grow throughout the story, and their growth individually and together is beautiful. They learn to love each other not despite their imperfections, but love each other for who they truly are, imperfections and all. While the main love rival for Godai, Mikata, a tennis coach who comes from a rich family, pursues Kyoko and plays the role of her savior, a lifeline from her first marriage, offering her a great life while looking past the social baggage that comes from being a widow, Godai loves Kyoko because of the person she is today, because of her previous marriage, and doesn't see it as baggage. He considers Kyoko to be way out of his league throughout the whole series and adores her. Godai knows Kyoko is the person she is today because of the experiences of her first marriage, and he understands that her previous husband will always be a part of Kyoko and accepts the fact that her first marriage will always be a part of her life and character. Godai has to come to terms with being content, not comparing himself to Kyoko's first husband, and this is something he struggles to come to terms with throughout most of the story. Godai isn't the only character with a love rival in the story, as Kyoko also has other women pursuing Godai. And these women frustrate Kyoko at times, but more importantly, forces her to break down her own walls she has built up after the death of her husband, and look inward to what she wants in her life and why she gets jealous over Godai. Despite being a widow, Kyoko is not as mature as you think she is. Because she got married so early in life, she has a lot of growing to do throughout the series, and often isn't honest with herself or others. Moving away from the two main characters of Maison Ikkoku, it's important to bring up the supporting cast and their roles in the story. I'll start with the previously mentioned love rivals for our protagonists, starting with Mikata, who is introduced early on in the story. He is very serious in his pursuit of Kyoko, and him and Godai have very different approaches in their desire to be with Kyoko. Mikita thinks more on the line of society, believing in Kyoko's first marriage is a bad thing, but is willing to look past it for the sake of love, and believes it's good for Kyoko to move on and get remarried, so she can get back to enjoying life, thinking that it's the best way to heal from her tragedy. While Godai understands that healing takes time and it depends on the person how long that is, Godai understands the person he fell in love with is a widow, and there's no what if she wasn't. That's not the Kyoko he knows. Even though the two are rivals in love and are often at odds with each other, there's no hate between them, and they even form a bit of a friendship throughout the series, never becoming too uncivil with each other. Mikata is everything Godai isn't. He's very good looking and has lots of women fawning over him. He's successful and is in the position to get married and settle down, and he's very outgoing in his pursuit of Kyoko. Mikata even contrasts Godai's honesty very well, often hiding his shortcomings like his fear of dogs or pettiness from other people, while Godai is very honest with his shortcomings of being a poor student and doesn't hide his status. The way Mikata contrasts who Godai is as a potential suitor to Kyoko is well done throughout the whole series, and the only thing I don't like about his character is how desperate he becomes towards the end of his pursuit of Kyoko. Now, I mentioned that Kyoko has two love rivals throughout the series, and the first one I'll talk about is Kozu. She's an ex-coworker of Godai and is a very honest and outgoing girl. She makes her appearance a bit after Mikata, after she happens by Godai by chance. Godai was originally going to ask Kyoko on a date to the movies, but was too late, as Kyoko was already taken on a date by Mikata. Kozu sees Godai with the tickets and asks if she can go with him. After this, Kozu would be under the impression that Godai and her were pursuing each other, and would be a rival in love to Kyoko throughout most of the series. Kozu differs from every other person pursuing a romance in the series, as she's completely oblivious to how people feel around her. While both Godai and Mikata are aware of how the other person feels about Kyoko, and Kyoko is for the most part aware of the feelings of the men pursuing her, Kozu is different, as she is under the impression Kyoko and Mikata are seeing each other, and her and Godai are an item. She doesn't know about any of the love triangles in the series, and this puts her in a unique position. Godai has a very difficult time breaking things off with Kozu throughout the series, as she doesn't really have any bad traits apart from being a bit oblivious to Godai's feelings. Whenever Godai tries to set things straight with Kozu, she usually misunderstands him, or Godai is in a position where he would be a cruel person if he were to break up with Kozu. The funny thing is that Kozu eventually breaks things off with Godai after one of the most important misunderstandings in the series, involving one of the tenets of Maison Ikkoku that would play a pivotal role in both ending things with Kozu and getting Kyoko and Godai together. I mentioned previously that Kyoko has another love rival in the story, and that's Ibuki Yagami. She makes her appearance a bit after the halfway mark of the series, and her immediate crush on Godai actually stems from a misunderstanding. This happens later in the story, while Godai is participating in a student-teacher program at none other than Kyoko's old high school. Up to this point, Godai has had an impossible time seeing a picture of Kyoko's old husband, and he knows that he was a former teacher at the school he is teaching at. So while on break, Godai can't help his insecurities and goes to find a yearbook with his picture in it. Unfortunately, it's not meant to be, with the picture having ink spilt on it. Godai lets out a defeated sigh, saying he's such an idiot wasting his time on someone who's already dead. Yagami overhears this and assumes Godai is hung up on a deceased lover who used to attend the high school. After this moment, Yagami sees Godai in a completely different light, considering him to be a tragic romantic and instantly developing a crush on him. What separates Yagami from Kozu is that Yagami quickly becomes aware of Godai and Kyoko's feelings, and she goes on the offensive at any chance to try and win over Godai. Her crush quickly develops into an obsession, and this annoys Kyoko to no end, as Kyoko is constantly flip-flopping from seeing Yagami's crush as harmless and expecting it to end as quickly as it came, to getting very jealous of how straightforward Yagami is with Godai and her aggressive approach to romance with him. After all, Kyoko met her husband in the very same high school and was in a similar position to Yagami. This puts Kyoko in a difficult position where she can't judge Yagami because she was in the same position herself. Yagami's last appearance in the manga, excluding the last chapter, is chapter 117, in which Yagami chastises Kyoko for not being true to her feelings for Godai, being under the assumption that Kyoko is afraid of heartbreak, when the reality is Kyoko loved her previous husband so much, she's afraid falling in love with someone else would compromise her first love and make it meaningless. This is later revealed to Yagami by her teacher, who also taught Kyoko when she was in school. After Yagami finds this out, she visits Kyoko at Maison Ikkoku to call her a coward. This is the last time we see Yagami apart from the conclusionary chapter where she is going into college and is still hung up on Godai, refusing to go to a mixer with her friends, calling herself a romantic. You can make the argument Yagami was an unnecessary character, but I feel she brought a lot to the story as a different kind of rival to Kyoko. It made her think much more about her feelings for Godai than Kozu ever did. Yagami also spiced up the manga a lot, with her bits in the series usually being very quickly paced compared to most of the content in the first half of the manga. The main problem I have with Yagami's involvement in the story is her sudden and abrupt disappearance from the series with no good conclusion to her character or involvement in the story. Of course, Yagami always felt more like a love rival who was needed just to bring out Kyoko in ways Kozu couldn't, and Yagami departed from the story when she achieved changing Kyoko and opening her to change her feelings. Ultimately, there was no one else who would call Kyoko a coward and challenge her, not only in the pursuit of Godai, but challenge her to open her heart to love another. Yagami was never meant to be a serious love rival. She was meant to interact with Kyoko and have an impact on her character growth and perspective, not Godai's. It's about time I mentioned the eccentric residents of Maison Ikkoku, as they make up a large portion of the supporting cast in the series. First, we have Akemi, the scantily dressed boozy bar hostess who is often wearing naughty nightwear and has a sexual aura around her, and like many of the other residents of Maison Ikkoku, she enjoys drinking and tormenting Godai. Next, we have Godai's next door neighbor, Mr. Yotsuya, the most eccentric character of Maison Ikkoku who enjoys voyeurism and mooching off others. He's also a big drinker and enjoys bugging Godai. But part of his character is that he's completely surrounded in mystery. We don't know what he does for work or anything about his family. And the final residents of Maison Ikkoku I want to mention are the Ichinose family, which include Mr. and Mrs. Ichinose and their son Kentaro. Mrs. Ichinose is the most notable, as she often spends her time partying with Akemi and Yotsuya at Godai's expense, or spending time with Kyoko at tennis club. Mrs. Ichinose loves gossip and dancing and often spreads rumors around, whether they are true or not. These eccentric characters are often a catalyst for many of the things that happen in the story. Like when I mentioned before that Kozu broke up with Godai after a misunderstanding, that misunderstanding was caused by Akemi, as she called Godai to come pick her up from a love hotel, and Kozu saw them as they were leaving. The residents of Maison Ikkoku are for the most part bad people, who take advantage of Godai and Kyoko many times throughout the story, rarely doing anything kind in return. But they still form important relationships with both Godai and Kyoko, and no doubt play a pivotal role in the story. There are a few other residents of Maison Ikkoku, but they aren't exactly notable enough to talk about in this video. I'll speak briefly on the ending of Maison Ikkoku, so if you don't want to be spoiled on the ending, skip to the conclusion at the time shown on screen. Maison Ikkoku no doubt sticks the landing when it comes to ending the series. The slow buildup of the first half was met perfectly by the quick pacing of the later volumes of the story, successfully completing multiple character story arcs in entertaining, dramatic, and fulfilling ways. Most of the characters who hadn't already settled down do so at the end of Maison Ikkoku. Mikata gets married and has 2 twins, Kozu marries a co-worker from her bank job and moves away, even Akemi ends up marrying her boss and settling down. And of course, the end to Maison Ikkoku is Godai and Kyoko returning to Maison Ikkoku with their newborn daughter in hand after getting married. It's a great ending to a superb series that delivers on multiple levels throughout the manga. Maison Ikkoku is an incredible coming-of-age story for both Godai and Kyoko, and seeing their relationship develop through the story naturally over the course of 6 years is something you won't find in most romance manga. Speaking of which, the focus of having a love story about young adults who don't exactly fit into the mold of Japanese society is another stroke of genius that separates Maison Ikkoku apart from most romance manga, which are usually set in high school, focused on 2 people falling in love with each other, often dealing with awkwardness of young love and the idealism that comes with first love. While Maison Ikkoku presents imperfect characters with social baggage who aren't made for each other just because love at first sight, but are made for each other because they as people grow together and learn to love each other through hardships and the acceptance of their own imperfections, what really is the defining feature of Maison Ikkoku are the mature and realistic themes that you either don't get from a romance manga or are not real and relatable if present. Over 40 years later, Maison Ikkoku still stands as a legendary romance manga that I can't help seeing as a true Rumiko Takahashi masterpiece. And that brings us to the end of my video on Maison Ikkoku. I really love this series, and for me, Maison Ikkoku really stands out for its quality above many other romance manga. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and thank you for watching.